What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
I will start at the table because that is where it happened and because it tells you everything you need to know about my sister and about me, since I was sitting there in a dress I had saved for, hoping to finally have one night that was mine. When she leaned back in her chair, tipped her chin like a game show host revealing a grand prize, and said in that breezy voice she uses when she wants something to land like an accident, "Too bad everyone is talking about my baby now and the air around." The table didn't so much freeze as rearrange itself, because forks stopped halfway, my aunt blinked twice, my mother clapped the way people clap when they are pretending not to be shocked, and my fiancé slid his palm across my knee under the table, steady and slow, as if to say do not swing at the first pitch no matter how tempting it looks. I smiled the kind of smile that says I am not surprised even though I am, and I heard myself congratulate her in a voice that was calmer than I felt, and I watched as the conversation slid off me like water down a sink. Because now the questions were about due dates and nursery colors and whether she had told work, and my father began reciting some story about when we were kids and how she always knew how to make an entrance. And it did not matter that we were there to celebrate my engagement, because she had found a way to stand on top of it and wave, and I could feel the old familiar ache behind my ribs, the one that comes from being the person who waits her turn and then watches the line move around her anyway. There are moments when you can feel yourself choosing the kind of person you are, not in theory but in real time, and I knew right then that I could make a scene. I could ask her if she picked this night on purpose. I could list every birthday and graduation where she had pulled a similar stunt and then cried when called out, and the table would go quiet and I would be the problem again, the dramatic one, the ungrateful one, the one who ruined a family dinner by refusing to be gracious. So I took a long breath, reached for my glass, and asked her if she was feeling okay, which made my mother pat my hand and tell me I was such a good sister, and that sentence landed like a dare, because if I was such a good sister, why did it always cost me? I listened as my fiancé handled it the way he handles messy meetings, asking the kind of small questions that keep people talking until they tell on themselves, and I watched my sister slip and say she had known for a while but wanted to share at the right time, then glanced straight at me to see if I had caught it, and I felt that switch flip in my head, the one that moves you from hurt to strategy, because when someone shows you their playbook that clearly, the only rude thing is to ignore it. We ate dessert we did not taste. We took a photo where she slid in so tight that the camera might as well have been her mirror, and people hugged us at the door with those thin compliments that try to cover how the evening actually went. And the second the car doors shut, my fiancé blew out a laugh that had no humor in it and said, "If she wants the stage, we build a stage with rules," and I almost cried from the relief of not being alone in my own story, because that sentence was the first time all night that something felt solid under my feet. We drove home and did not talk about fairness, because fairness is a myth you tell children to help them fall asleep. We talked about boundaries, about how adults set them in writing and enforce them with calm. And we pulled out our laptops at the kitchen table like two people opening toolboxes, and we wrote a new save the date that was not a tantrum, but a line: adults only ceremony and reception, no children or infants, limited toasts by invitation, personal announcements reserved for hosts only, gratitude in advance for helping us keep the focus on the marriage we are building, and we attached it to a short message that said we were so excited to celebrate and that a few details had changed. And we sent that updated card out before midnight to every single person who had been at that dinner and to everyone else on the list, and then we sat there with our cups going cold and said nothing for a while. Because the first move in a long game is to act like you have been playing it all along, and because I wanted the sound of her smirk to be replaced in my head by the quiet click of a boundary being set in ink, which, for once, felt like a win I did not need anyone else to applaud. By the time I woke up the next morning, I was not replaying the dinner anymore. I was replaying my whole childhood like someone had pressed fast forward on a reel of moments where I had learned to move my chair a few inches to make room. Because that was the rhythm in our house, my sister stepping into the center in a way that always looked unplanned even when you could see the seams, the kindergarten talent show where she tripped in a way that made a better memory than my careful song, the high School graduation where she turned a forgotten tassel into a family emergency that carried us through the parking lot and away from the photos. The college weekend where I brought home a job offer and she arrived 2 hours later with a crisis about her roommate that needed everyone's immediate attention and successfully pushed my folder to the end table where no one opened it, and none of those things ruined me. They just trained me to be the person who understands that a spotlight is not a light, it is a habit, and if you do not interrupt it, the beam will keep moving to the same place every time. I made coffee and told myself I was not going to turn into a detective picking apart motives, and then I opened my phone and found the first text from my mother, which was a mix of excitement and a soft scold about how I could have been more effusive. And I almost laughed because there it was again, the tidy script where my job is to make sure other people feel like the main character even when the invitation had my name on it, and I typed back something polite because I am not trying to rewrite my mother, I am trying to rewrite the event, which is a very different kind of project, and that is when Evan came into the kitchen and said, "We are not going to persuade anyone with feelings. We are going to make it easier for them to do the right thing than the wrong thing," and suddenly it felt like a meeting with a clear objective instead of an argument with a moving target. We opened the laptop and built a wedding site that did not look like a power move so much as a manual, a clean page with the date repeated enough times to make it stick. A clear note at the top that the celebration is adults only to help us keep the focus on the ceremony and the commitments we are making, an RSVP form that asks guests to agree to a short code of conduct written like common sense, no surprise speeches, no personal announcements, microphones managed by our MC, questions about timing or participation directed to us in advance. Thank you for helping us keep this celebration centered, and the more we wrote it, the calmer I felt, because the rule was not about my sister, it was about the event I am hosting. And a host has the right to set rules, and adults can either accept them or decide not to come, which is also fine. Then we pulled up the family group chat that has been running since my cousin's wedding, the one that was so busy last night with ultrasound jokes that my engagement photo scrolled out of view, and I asked my cousin, who runs the thing like a volunteer stage manager, to make me an admin for a week so I could post the site link and lock the thread to announcements only, and she said absolutely and added a winky face, and I told her this was not about punishing anyone, this was about quieting the hallway so people could hear the doorbell, and she got it right away because she has 3 kids and understands bandwidth better than anyone. We called my parents next because they were always going to be the choke point, and Evan did the part where he says we are so excited to celebrate with you and we need your help to make the day flow. And he asked my father to do the single toast on behalf of the family and to keep it under 5 minutes, and he asked my mother to be the point person for any relatives who have questions about the adults-only note. And he framed it like a favor rather than a restriction, and I could hear how flattered they were, which is the whole trick, because people will protect boundaries they feel responsible for. And then I made the move that felt like a kindness wrapped around a guardrail, which is my favorite kind of move, because I called my Aunt Denise, who never misses a chance to host. And I told her I would pay for a catered brunch at her house 2 Sundays from now if she would send a message today titled Celebrating Lila's News and make it feel warm and big and exactly the kind of attention my sister craves. And my aunt practically sprinted through the phone to say yes, and within an hour she had an invitation drafted that made clear this would be the place for gifts and questions and sentimental speeches and all the baby energy, which meant that every relative who wanted to pour their excitement somewhere now had a container with a lid. And the wedding had one less risk point for hijacking. When that brunch invite hit the family chat, I watched the typing bubbles appear and vanish like people were practicing what side they were on, and then my mother chimed in with that grateful tone she uses when the path is paved for her. And my cousin pinned the wedding site above it like a pair of train tracks, and finally my sister texted me privately to ask if I was behind this, with a sentence that pretended to be a compliment but was really a complaint about tone, and I wrote back that I was trying to make sure everyone got what they wanted, a proper celebration for her and a clean event for us, and that I hoped she would come to both, and I put my phone face down, because the second revenge of the week was not a clapback or a confrontation. It was a calendar, and I had just moved her spotlight onto a date that was not mine. What settled me that morning was not a speech in the mirror or some brave little mantra about being unbothered. It was the feeling of a checklist turning into a map. Because once Evan and I agreed that we were not going to argue about feelings with people who only hear their own echoes, we could treat the whole thing like a project with inputs, outputs, and failure points. Which is exactly how I opened my laptop and began replacing vague hope with structure, starting with a single point of contact email that forwarded to both of us so that every vendor, every family liaison, and every well-meaning relative had one doorway and one set of rules. Since chaos always starts with back doors and side conversations that pretend to be helpful while smuggling in exceptions. We rewrote the RSVP flow so that it felt friendly on the surface and firm underneath. A short welcome that asked guests to confirm attendance and then, tucked into the same page like a seatbelt you automatically reach for. A brief agreement that the celebration is adults only, that microphones are scheduled and managed by our MC, that personal announcements are reserved for the hosts, and that requests for a toast must be submitted in advance through a simple form that asks what you plan to say and why. And although that language sounds fussy when you read it out loud, on a screen it reads like common sense, which is the point, because reasonable guardrails make unreasonable behavior obvious without us having to point and shout. The clever part, and I say clever because I allowed myself that small satisfaction while keeping my tone steady, was the little branching logic Evan set up behind the toast request, where anyone who selected that they intended to do a personal announcement received an immediate polite decline that thanked them for the thought and explained the event policy again, while quietly copying both sets of parents so that the conversation could not be rewritten later as a misunderstanding, and I cannot tell you how soothing it felt to imagine that boundary living in writing where it could not be smiled past or turned into a family legend about my bad attitude. We called the venue coordinator and told her that we wanted a run of show that protected the ceremony and the first hour after, no open microphone, no spontaneous anything. And she said she wished more couples did this because most problems come from people who think a wedding is an open mic night, which made me feel seen in a way that my own family rarely manages. And we booked a short meeting with the MC to give him the line we wanted used if anyone tried to wander toward the stage. A friendly reminder that the couple has asked me to keep the focus on the vows and the planned toasts. Thank you for understanding, and then a change of song, because control is not only rules, it is momentum. I reached out to my cousin who is a nurse and a miracle worker when it comes to keeping people calm, and I asked her if she would be our unofficial floor lead for the family, which is a polite way of asking someone to be a bouncer in nice shoes. And I told her exactly what to say if my sister began doing that thing where she turns a question into a campaign. Something like, let me help you get a glass of water, and we can text the couple later about that, and my cousin laughed in that grateful way people laugh when you finally give them permission to do what they were already going to do, which is to protect the room from nonsense. Because I know my sister does not go through front doors if a side window is cracked, we also updated our contracts so that vendors are required to ignore requests that do not come from the event email, not because I think she will bribe the DJ with cupcakes, although I would not put it past her, but because people who want exceptions will always claim urgency and kindness and old favors, and I wanted a paper fence that did not rely on anybody's spine, and when the coordinator said she would attach that note to the staff briefing, I felt that pleasant click of something heavy being put in place. When we pushed the updated save the date link that night with the calmer language and the crisp boundaries and the brunch invitation already cushioning the people who wanted baby talk, I told myself to stop refreshing, and then of course I refreshed anyway. Which is exactly how I saw the first wave of RSVPs roll in with little green check marks that felt like tiny votes for sanity, and then, a few minutes later, one request for a toast that said we would like to share a special family announcement and promise to keep it short, and before I could even show Evan, the automation had already sent the polite decline with the policy reminder and the quiet copy to my parents, which is when my phone buzzed with a message from my mother asking if I had seen what Lila just tried to do and whether I could please explain the rule to her directly. And while I typed a measured reply that said the rule applies to everyone and is not personal, the screen lit up with my sister's name and a single line. That read "Call me right now," which I did not do, because the revenge for tonight was not a confrontation at full volume. It was a paper trail at normal volume, and it had just started working. The message that lit my screen just after lunch was not surprising, because my sister does not like to lose control of a room she thinks belongs to her. But the part that made me set my coffee down slowly was the fake warmth at the top. The "Hey love" and the "We should talk like adults" and the line about how my rules made her feel excluded as a future mother, which would have landed differently if she had not spent the last decade treating every family milestone like a runway, and I let myself read the whole thing twice so that when I answered, I would not be answering the bait. Then I wrote back with that steady cadence I use for HR emails, saying, "I hear you. The adults only note is not aimed at you. The microphone policy is for everyone. The brunch at Antonice's is already set up to celebrate your news properly, and the part you might not have noticed is that we are paying for it so that you do not have to, which means you get the attention you want without taking it from the centerpiece we are building." And while I watched the typing bubble sputter and disappear, I forwarded the thread to the event email so it would live with the others. Because a boundary without a receipt is just a story that can be rewritten later by the loudest voice in the room. She did not text again. She showed up, which is exactly her brand, and she came with that brittle brightness that sounds like kindness to people who do not know her tells. And she launched into a monologue in my doorway about how the rule would alienate younger cousins and how I was turning a wedding into a board meeting. And I let her talk until she ran out of steam, and then I pointed to the printed save the date on the counter and read the sentences out loud, not because she cannot read, but because people who traffic in vibes do not like the sound of plain language. And I told her the same thing I had already told the group chat, that adults only is to keep the ceremony focused and the evening smooth. That microphones are managed because surprise speeches have a way of turning into hostage situations, that personal announcements belong at events created for them, like the brunch she now had with her name on it and a guest list that looked like a family tree. And when she said so, "You are banning joy," I said, "I am banning chaos," and I watched her flinch because she recognized herself in the word and hated that it came without decoration. She tried a different route and said that a gender reveal during our reception would be a once-in-a-lifetime family memory that would bond everyone, and that is when Evan, who had stayed quiet because he knows a 2-on-1 argument is what she likes to count as proof that I am difficult, slid into the kitchen with the calm of a person who reads contracts for fun and explained that the venue's insurance rider prohibits confetti, powder, smoke, and any unapproved pyrotechnics that our DJ contract requires all cues to come from the MC, and that any attempt to break those rules would trigger a fee automatically charged to the host of the interruption, which in our paperwork is defined as the person initiating the act. And he said it without heat, like weather, and I saw the color drain from the plan she had been forming behind her eyes, because there is no charm offensive strong enough to outtalk a signed policy. Minutes later my mother called, clearly looped in by my sister's preemptive narrative, and asked if I could please reconsider the adults-only part because some relatives would be traveling and might not have childcare, and I said I hear that. Which is why we chose an evening slot, and why we offered to cover a sitter at the hotel for anyone who needs it, and I could feel the conversation flip because this was not me being rigid, this was me having thought of the friction points in advance, and then my father got on the line and said he appreciated the clarity and that he would help reinforce it, and my sister, still at my counter, made that choking sound she makes when the crowd does not fall in line. And I did not gloat because gloating is loud and I am done being loud for other people's benefit, but I did file the moment away as proof that preparation is not pettiness, it is oxygen. The pushback moved online the way these things do, a cousin posting a vague status about controlling brides that was so generic it could have been anyone and yet landed in my inbox 6 times within an hour with the subject line, "Is this about you?" And I let it sit because the machine feeds on speed. Then I did something that made Evan grin like a man who loves a clean play, which was to post one calm update to the wedding page titled "What to Expect," a short FAQ in my voice that answered every logical question, from dress code to parking to the sitter option to the MC note, and then a final line that said, "If you wish to celebrate Lila's news with toasts and gifts, Aunt Denise's brunch will be the perfect place. Details here." which turned the temperature down while also funneling every ounce of baby energy into the room designed to hold it, and the RSVPs that came in after that read like exhale noises. And the private notes from older relatives said thank you for being so organized. And for the first time in days I believed that my wedding might actually feel like my wedding. Just when I was thinking maybe the storm had passed, my phone lit with a screenshot I was not meant to see because my sister's husband forwarded his text to the wrong thread, and there it was. A plan written in sloppy bravado about timing a surprise during our first dance, a quick color reveal with small poppers hidden in jackets. No one can stop it once it starts. And I watched the message land like a final confirmation that my instincts were not paranoia, they were pattern recognition, and I did not call or rage or send a paragraph. I forwarded the screenshot to the venue coordinator with a short note asking her to add it to the staff briefing and to the MC with the instruction that if anyone approaches the floor with anything in their hands during our dance, the music shifts immediately to the next track and security handles it, and then, because there is a limit to how many times I will let the same person script my day, I opened a draft addressed to the entire guest list with one more clarification, not a threat and not a scold, just a crisp line that said we will have a phone-free ceremony and a protected first dance. Details at the link. Thank you for helping us keep these moments ours. And I hovered over send long enough to feel like this was not retaliation but reinforcement. Then I clicked, knowing the next move was hers and that whatever she tried would meet a wall built out of her own words, which, for the first time in our lives, I was ready to show everyone, without saying a single ugly thing. What finally settled it for me was the simple truth that the only part of a wedding I could not outsource or rebuild was the moment where we said the words that made us a family. So on the morning of our supposed big day, with the schedule already tightened and the policies already posted and the MC already briefed like a stage manager before a live broadcast that cannot afford a single rogue second, Evan and I went downtown with our two witnesses, signed the paper in a room that smelled like bureaucracy and relief, spoke our vows into a recorder so clean you could hear our breath steady halfway through, hugged our parents in a lobby where no one clapped because there was no audience to impress, and walked back out knowing that the evening to come was not a fragile ceremony that could be cracked by someone else's impulse, but a party celebrating something already completed, which meant that the worst my sister could do was embarrass herself in a room full of adults who had been warned and warmed and given easier ways to behave, and for the first time since the dinner I felt like I was not bracing for impact, but steering the wheel. We sent one last calm update that afternoon, a tidy message thanking everyone for the love, and reminding them that the ceremony moment would be private and phone-free, that the first dance would be uninterrupted by request, and that we could not wait to celebrate after the essentials were honored. And then I put my phone face down, because I did not need the drip of commentary in my head while I zipped up my dress and took a breath that belonged to nobody but me. And when we walked into the venue, the room felt like a meeting already in progress where the agenda had been shared, the MC greeting people by name and pointing them to their seats, the coordinator quietly collecting anything that looked like a party store impulse purchase, and my cousin, who had agreed to be our calm traffic cop, giving me a discreet signal that read, "We have eyes on the usual suspects, and they are already rewriting their plans in their heads." The first attempt came fast and clumsy the way bad ideas usually do, with my sister's husband drifting toward the floor during the transition into our dance holding nothing in his hands, but that particular nervous energy people get when they are about to improvise past a rule, and the MC, who has seen more parties than any of us, stepped in with a smile and a switch of song that turned the momentum before the man's second foot left the carpet, while security did exactly what they were hired to do, which was nothing dramatic other than escort him to the side and remind him that the host had covered fees for almost everything except the kind of interruption he was about to attempt. And by the time I had finished my first turn in Evan's arms, the room had chosen a side without me saying a single sharp word, because there is nothing more clarifying than a boundary enforced without a scene. When the formal toasts began, my father did what we asked and kept it brief and kind. My mother wiped her eyes. The MC moved us into cake, and that is where the second attempt tried to live. A little speech my sister had clearly rehearsed about the expanding family and the beauty of new beginnings, which would have been harmless if it had stayed in the land of general sentiment. But I recognized the wind-up to a reveal, and I also recognized the way the room started to hold its breath, so. Before she reached the point of no return, the MC raised his hand, thanked her for those beautiful words, and invited everyone to save their personal announcements for Aunt Denise's brunch. The details of which had just been pinned again in the group chat, so that even the least attentive relative could not pretend to have missed it, and the applause that followed was not for me exactly. It was for the relief of not being dragged into someone else's plan again, and my sister looked at me with that incredulous face she uses when consequences arrive dressed as logistics, and I looked back at her without heat, because the victory was not humiliation, it was silence where noise used to be. We played the audio of our vows near the end of the night, not on a screen, not as a spectacle, just a clean clip through the speakers while the room dimmed and people rested their hands on the backs of chairs. And I listened to my own voice say the thing I had wanted to protect, and I watched my father's shoulders drop, and I felt the crowd settle into the simple fact that the most important part had already been done long before anyone could try to turn it into content, which meant there was nothing left to hijack, and after that the music rose, the dance floor filled, and the evening became exactly what it should have been from the start, which is a celebration without auditions. Sometime after the last song, when shoes were off and relatives were figuring out rides, my phone buzzed with a short message from my sister that said, "You made me look ridiculous, and I hope you are happy," and I typed back slower than she probably expected, telling her that I did not make her look like anything, that I simply made it impossible for her to make me look small, that Aunt Denise's brunch was going to be beautiful, and that I hoped she would let herself be the center there without using my day as a launching pad, and I put the phone away because the conversation I cared about was already finished, the one where I proved to myself that you can change a family rhythm without a public meltdown, that you can build a wall high enough to block the old pattern without hardening into a person you do not recognize, and that you can send a save the date at night, watch the smirk fall off a face that has fed on your patience for years, and still walk into your own future without the taste of revenge sitting heavy on your tongue, because it was never about punishing her, it was about writing my own ending and then living in it.